Trade deadline week, injuries, and maybe some dumb coaching altered some key situations for us this week. We're sorting through all that, though, to find some potentially surprising help for the stretch run of your fantasy season. Who's hiding good usage behind weak numbers, and who might be okay to give up on at this point? You're going to find out on an all-new Draft Sharks podcast right now. Matt Schauf and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to help you get ready for Week 10 of the fantasy football season and beyond. We're going to sort through the fallout from this week's key trades. We'll look at the impacts of some injuries and maybe some injury returns, but we're going to start with a guy who's still a little difficult to talk about around here. Jared, why should I buy Ken Walker?
Yeah, it didn't show up in the box score last week, but I think we got some notable shifts in usage in Seattle's backfield coming off the bye week. So just from at a macro level, Ken Walker set season highs last week in games with Zach Charbonnet, so not including the game Charbonnet missed, but season highs for Walker with a 54% snap rate and a 50% route rate. Where do those extra snaps come from? Walker played more passing down snaps than Zach Charbonnet for the first time all season. He also outsnapped Zach Charbonnet 4-1 inside the 5-yard line. Prior to last week, Charbonnet had outsnapped Ken Walker 14-1 inside the 5. So, as always in the NFL and fantasy football, it could just be a one-game blip. They could shift back to, what it had been next week, or this could kind of be the start of Walker being at least a clear 1A in this backfield, because he has continued to be the better player here. Pretty much any efficiency metric you want to look at, Ken Walker's been better than Zach Charbonnet. So definitely possible that Seattle looked at the situation during their bye week, came out and said, we're going to make Walker the clear lead here. And if that's the case in this offense that is scoring so many points, I do think Ken Walker could, not be the RB1 that we thought he could be in the summer, but I think he could be a weekly RB2 if he continues to get this type of usage.
Yeah, I think that's the first key to why he's buyable right now is we need him to be something different than we did at draft time. When we were drafting him, we were like, all right, this guy's an RB2 with, we hope, upside into the RB1 range. That's not the expectation anymore. So if that's what you're thinking when we talk about him, you need to change it. Now we're looking at a guy who's viewed as an RB3, who might be able to give us RB2 production the rest of the way. And that's the key. If we can get that, we're happy with picking him up at this point. And a couple of key factors in there, Jared. One is that it is coming out of the bye, so some more planning went into it. It is just 1 week. We don't want to put too much on 1 week. But when that 1 week is coming out of having extra time to plan things out, that should mean that there is more weight to what the team did within that game. Of course, it's still a matchup league, so maybe there's something about Washington that favored Ken Walker, but still, especially that goal line usage, like sometimes it can be luck that drives who happens to get the opportunities down there. But we saw multiple times where Ken Walker was got pulled near the goal line, and Zach Charbonnet came in for the touchdown run. So if Seattle came out of the bye and didn't do that and instead gave Ken Walker more time down there, that seems deliberate. So, we'll see where it goes from here, but it's definitely a positive development. And it's an offense that's been good overall and has continued to lean run, but also hasn't been very efficient running the ball. So maybe part of the reason that we saw this shift in RB usage is them saying, all right, guys, we tried this split the first half of the season. We need to get more efficient. We're going to go with the more talented running back, and that's Ken Walker.
Yeah, it makes sense to me. Now, I will say Ken Walker got stuffed on, I think it was a couple carries from inside the 5-yard line. So might not help his cause for, continuing to get those carries going forward. But again, I think it's just a gamble I'm willing to take. And it's just, as you said, Matt, I think you could probably get Walker for pretty cheap at this point because he has continued to disappoint in terms of actual fantasy points. So, if you can pay an RB3 price for him, again, I think he could be an RB2 the rest of the way.
Yeah, and that's the key. Don't overpay to get him. It's not like Ken Walker's about to save your season. It's more like hey, Ken Walker might be a helpful piece for your team the rest of the way. So if you can buy him, go for it. The bigger news in Seattle this week, of course, was the Seahawks acquiring Rashid Shaheed from the Saints. He played under current OC Clint Kubiak in Seattle. Okay. He played under Clint Kubiak, who is currently the OC in Seattle, was the OC in New Orleans last year, so familiarity there. And the Seahawks notably gave 4th and 5th round picks in the upcoming draft for Shaheed, who is on an expiring contract. So they're getting a half a season of him. Maybe they want to re-sign him beyond that. But for now, they gave 2 draft picks to get a half season of Rashid Shaheed. We talked a little bit about what to expect from Shaheed in the offense on Tuesday's show, but now that we've had a little bit more time, Jared, what are you expecting from Shaheed in Seattle and maybe, others around him in the offense impacted?
Yeah, I love Rashid Shaheed. I think he's an underrated player. I love the fit here in the Seahawks passing game. I think, his speed element is going to play really well here. Sam Darnold's been awesome throwing downfield this season. This gives him another weapon to throw to downfield. I do think, though, I'm a little less excited about Shaheed as a fantasy asset than just what I've seen out there in the general fantasy community. And for me, it starts with, obviously, like we talked about with Kenneth Walker, this remains a pretty low volume passing game. Seattle's 30th in pass attempts per game, 31st in pass rate, 29th in neutral pass rate. Maybe that climbs a little bit. I think it probably should with how good Darnold's been, but I don't think this is going to turn into like a high volume passing game. We have Jackson Smith and Jig, but we know he's going to continue to dominate targets here. Again, probably not to the same extent. I think Shaheed maybe takes some volume from JSN going forward, but still the clear alpha in this passing game. And then the personnel usage in Seattle. 3 wide receivers on the field for Seattle, just 36% of their snaps this season. That's second lowest in the league. We'll see when Cooper Kupp gets healthy again. He remained sidelined in Wednesday's practice, and I'm betting against him playing this week. But when Kupp's healthy, I still just think this team that wants to run the ball so much, I think he's going to be on the field a decent amount because of his blocking ability. So I just don't think Shaheed's going to be like an every down player in this offense. So couple that with the low volume in general, I think you're looking at 4 or 5 targets for Shaheed in a lot of games, and he's going to pop for some big games because of the downfield ability. He's going to hit some big plays, but I think he's going to be kind of frustrating to have in start sit fantasy leagues going forward.
I think that 4 to 5 target expectation on a weekly basis is fair for him, regardless of exactly how they choose to deploy Shaheed and how he fits with what's already there. There are some unknowns clearly at play here, though. Cooper Kupp's injury situation is the first thing, still not practicing on Wednesday after missing that game against Washington. Maybe the Shaheed trade tells us something about that injury situation, and maybe that takes Cooper Kupp out of the equation for longer than we even know it's going to. But he's not on IR at this point, so they clearly don't expect him to be out for too long. I'll be surprised if Cooper Kupp returns to play more than Rashid Shaheed after they gave up 2 draft picks for an expiring contract on, a more gifted player at this point in their respective careers. We'll see exactly how they sort out. The other part of that is, maybe they made this move because they want to run more 3 wide receiver sets and didn't feel like they had the personnel to do so before acquiring Shaheed. So, again, we'll see on the playing time particulars. I would stop short of being excited about Shaheed as well, but he is in a spot that's good for maximizing the upside on what's available to him, I think, given how well Sam Darnold has thrown downfield and that there is, a potentially threatening level running game in an offense that wants to run the ball.
I think if you're using Shaheed weekly as a wide receiver 4 or flex, you're in good shape because all those guys have low floors. And I think he does have a low floor, but he does have a high ceiling. I just, if you're thinking he's going to be a top 30 fantasy receiver the rest of the way, I think that's going a bit too far.
Yeah, I think we're looking at somebody more like Trey Tucker or Darnell Mooney in what should be an efficient offense with a quarterback who's playing really well.
And more good news for Sam Darnold too. I think this is an awesome addition for the offense. We saw what Shaheed did in, a handful of games in this Clint Kubiak offense last year in New Orleans. It was really strong.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, this might just be an offense that's put together really well for real life that doesn't give us nearly as much fantasy value as it does the actual Seahawks.
Yep, Darnold, JSN, hopefully Ken Walker, and I think these other guys are kind of ping pong back and forth with production every week.
Of course, Shaheed leaves behind a dumpster fire in New Orleans. So, we need to look at what the impact is there, if any. If anybody besides Chris Olave is even worth paying any attention to in fantasy. To me, Jared, trading away Shaheed at least shows the Saints being willing to embrace some level of rebuild. This team has shoved that off for years now, paying way too much for guys who are not going to help them get any better. So I think trading away Shaheed is a good move for them in the long run. It probably means heavy targets for Chris Olave, though we'll see, what Tyler Shuck does. I'm sure opponents know that Chris Olave is going to be targeted heavily going forward, so we'll see how much the defensive attention impacts him there. Probably too many targets for Brandon Cooks, the de facto new number 2 wide receiver. I'm having trouble getting interested in anything besides Olave and Juwan Johnson in New Orleans, and even there, my interest level is mild.
Yeah, I think that's it. I do think Chris Olave probably sees like a 30+% target share the rest of the way. And even in a bad offense with a bad quarterback, it's kind of tough to not be pretty solid fantasy producer if you're getting 30+% of the targets. So I think Olave is going to be fine, kind of decent ceiling, low floor fantasy play. I do think Juwan Johnson has a chance to kind of get back closer to what he was early in the season, where he's getting, 6 to 8 targets per game. And that's useful. Again, the efficiency is not going to be great. Otherwise, Alvin Kamara in the backfield are kind of dead. No interest in Brandon Cooks, no interest in Devon Vele, who the Saints gave up more for Vele than they got for Rashid Shaheed in those trades, which is, just looks ridiculous at this point. But yeah, it's Chris Olave.
Kind of ridiculous at the time, honestly.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. So Chris Olave and then, Juwan Johnson as a fringe fantasy starter. That's it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Juwan Johnson, just to put some numbers to it, 2 straight 5-catch games before last week, and then 3 for 31, which is, nothing exciting, but did catch the only touchdown pass from Tyler Shuck in that loss to the Rams. So Juwan Johnson, mildly usable tight end. We'll see what Chris Olave does. I just updated him in our trade targets article for this week because we had him as a sell a couple weeks ago. He's kind of, I think, whatever you need for him to be. If you find somebody in your league expecting big targets going forward and good production, and you have an opportunity to move Chris Olave for an upgrade for your roster, I say go for it. If you don't find an attractive trade proposition anywhere, hang on to him. He's probably going to give you at least wide receiver 3 level production.
Yeah, my guess would be, if anything, he's underrated in fantasy circles right now, just because people don't want anything to do with this Saints offense. So that's me, the projections guy, just because I think we're going to be projecting Olave for like 10 targets a game. And it's kind of tough to fail on that level of volume. But I don't know, maybe the offense is so bad that Olave can fail on 10 targets a game.
10 targets, 4 catches, 53 yards. There we go. Lock it up.
Could be.
Jakobi Meyers, the other big trade, going to Jacksonville. No practice for Brian Thomas Jr. this week, on Wednesday, that is, at least, on his ankle injury that he added to a shoulder injury. The team also has De'Ami Brown in a concussion protocol. And I start with those things before getting into Jakobi Meyers, of course, because Jacksonville needs him, and that might impact how much he plays right away. It's certainly going to impact how much he gets the ball over at least the next few weeks, when they will also be without Travis Hunter. So what's the outlook for Jakobi Meyers here in Jacksonville?
Yeah, he probably is going to play something close to a full slate of snaps, I would guess, this week, just because, like you said, and that's assuming Brian Thomas Jr.'s out, which we are assuming at this point. It sounds like he didn't practice again on Thursday. We don't have the official report yet, but he wasn't out there for the start of practice. De'Ami Brown was limited Wednesday, so he has a chance to be cleared for Sunday. Tim Patrick was back at practice Wednesday. That's the type of guys we're talking about in this wide receiver core at this point. So I do think Meyers is going to play plenty. I would still not want to use him for a couple of reasons. One, he's going to have been with the team for 5 days when this game kicks off, so I can't imagine he's that comfortable in the offense or with Trevor Lawrence yet. And 2, this matchup against the Texans, who are the best wide receiver defense according to our adjusted fantasy points allowed to the position. So I still prefer Parker Washington. Liam Cohen did say this week that Washington is going to stay in the slot. Jakobi Meyers is going to be, primarily an outside receiver, alongside Brian Thomas, I would assume, when he's back. So that's how this receiver core is going to look like. We'll have Travis Hunter, I assume, back in the slot when he's healthy. But Parker Washington has the best matchup among these receivers. I think he's the best bet for targets. I think he's still usable as a wide receiver 3. Meyers, I would definitely not want to use this week.
It's nice to have the negative matchup line up with a game of uncertain playing time for Jakobi Meyers here, so that we're not motivated to try to play Meyers in the spot, especially, he's coming off a disappointing finish with the Raiders. Hasn't really been all that fantasy relevant for a while. So I agree. Definitely better to keep on your bench for now, but there's room for Meyers to make a fantasy impact, over the rest of this season.
Just looking further ahead, the Jags have the 5th toughest remaining wide receiver schedule for the season. That includes 4 top 9 wide receiver defenses. Now, one of those is the Jets, who just traded Sauce Gardner, so they kind of catch a break there. But the Jags also play the Colts twice more, so they're going to see Sauce Gardner twice. So it's definitely a tough schedule for all these Jacksonville wide receivers.
Yeah, a little good news, bad news for you there, Jaguars wideouts. And, another thing that you mentioned on Tuesday's show is we saw more of a rushing lean for the Jaguars offense in that return from the bye against the Raiders last week. So we'll see what happens on that front going forward, especially as some wide receivers get healthier. But, keep that in mind when you're considering Jaguars backfield pieces. It could be a better spot to play running backs going forward. Jakobi Meyers leaves behind a Vegas offense that's been rough for the entire season, and especially rough when Brock Bowers was out. Brock Bowers, of course, just returned. So we're recording this Thursday afternoon. The Raiders are playing tonight against the Broncos. So we've got some info here that you probably will already know by the time you're watching or listening to this that we don't currently have. that said, we're taking the longer look here, not looking for week 10 plays. So let's talk about what the departure of Jakobi Meyers means for this offense. The first point for me, Jared, is that Trey Tucker gets more interesting. He was already the kind of guy that you're like, I don't know, do I play him at this wide receiver 4 level? Do I play this other guy that I'm deciding between? And one of the key things working against him is, the target counts weren't great. So when you take really the only other viable wide receiver from this offense, that at least gives a slight boost to Trey Tucker's target outlook.
Yeah, I think he could be a wide receiver 3 going forward now. I wouldn't want to use him tonight against Denver, who even without Pat Surtain, it's just a tough wide receiver defense. I mean, Tucker's still usable, but it's definitely a matchup downgrade for him. I just, in general, you're going to see the Raiders probably lead the league in 2 tight end sets going forward. 58% of their offensive snaps last week had both Brock Bowers and Michael Mayer on the field together. I think that'll continue because there's not much at wide receiver behind Trey Tucker. They actually used Tyler Lockett as their number 2 wide receiver last week. Neither Jack Bech nor Dante Thornton played a single snap on offense in that game. I don't think either of those rookies is good. It's a small sample still. They didn't look like great prospects coming out to me. They haven't shown anything on the NFL field yet. So I would assume we're going to get those guys playing over Tyler Lockett, hopefully, for most of the rest of the season. But I just don't think either Bech or Thornton's going to be a viable fantasy option. So it's really just Bowers and Trey Tucker in this passing game.
I think a key factor with both Bech and Thornton is that they were overrated by the time we got to the draft. I mean, Bech looked like an intriguing day 3 level guy, and then he went in round 2, and we're like, oh, didn't realize that was going to happen. And Thornton basically did nothing in college and then impressed with his speed and then generated some buzz this summer, which is a time when fast wide receivers generate buzz. So that hyped expectations on both players. I think that we've got to wait a year, 2, 3 to see if there's really anything to these guys. And I don't expect any relevance, at least the rest of this year.
Yeah. And I'm going to be keeping an eye on the Michael Mayer stuff too. Just can he get enough volume to maybe be a spot start option for us, the rest of the way? I'm kind of betting against it. It's so rare to see 2 tight ends be fantasy factors, and it's still not a great Raiders passing game. It's been a lot better when Bowers has been healthy, but still not a spot where I think you're probably going to get 2 tight ends be fantasy relevant. But I'm at least going to keep an eye on what Mayer does these next couple of weeks now.
Yeah, I think it's going to have to be a deep league for Michael Mayer to really matter for you. Geno Smith, though, you would normally think if a team trades away its top wide receiver, that's bad news for the quarterback. But I don't think it really matters for Geno Smith because his fantasy relevance has swung on whether Brock Bowers is on the field. In 5 games so far in which Brock Bowers participated, and remember, like one of those has been a healthy Brock Bowers. 20.2 fantasy points per game for Geno Smith in those 5 contests. In the 3 games where he had no Brock Bowers, 8.4 fantasy points per game. So we still saw wide swings in the scoring in the games that did include Bowers, but that at least tells us that there's potential usability for Geno Smith in positive matchups as long as Brock Bowers is on the field. Whereas when there was no Bowers, it was a quarterback to forget about completely.
Yeah, the production swings for Geno have been wild this season. Even within that Bauer sample, it's been like super up and down. So I struggle to see him getting to a point where we're trusting him as a quarterback 1, but I do think he could be useful in super flex leagues the rest of the way.
Anything else you want to hit in this offense before we move on?
Yeah, can I talk about Ashton Jeanty real quick?
Because
I think he's going to have a nice second half of the season. Clear usage bump for Jeanty coming out of the bye week. Season high 90% snap rate, a mark we just don't see many running backs hit. 67% route rate for Jeanty. That was his second highest mark of the season. Controlled the passing game work, had a nice day receiving. Now, the rushing efficiency was still tough in that game. I think it's going to continue to be tough for him going forward, but I just think he's going to get enough volume, particularly in the passing game going forward. Now, again, with Jakobi Meyers' departure, then maybe Jeanty kind of picks up some of those targets as well. So, and the offense I think is going to be competent as long as Brock Bowers is healthy. So I think it's a better setup for Jeanty than he had over the first half of the season. I think he could be a top 12 fantasy back the rest of the way.
Yeah, to me, the usage, especially the receiving and an offense that's, obviously better with Brock Bowers on the field, are reasons that if you have Ashton Jeanty, you should feel better about him the rest of the way. The inefficiency, the fact that it's still not a good offense, the offensive line is still not good, that all keeps me from wanting to go try to buy Ashton Jeanty ahead of the second half.
Yep, that's fair.
All right, so let's move on to the Washington offense, which We talked about the optimism for the Raiders at this point, and it's the opposite for Washington, of course. Jayden Daniels suffered yet another injury to his left arm. His head coach has already said, I screwed up by leaving him in the game and letting him get hurt at that point where the game was out of hand. So we'll put that aside and just talk about the effect on this offense. It starts, of course, with the quarterback. For fantasy purposes, whenever Jayden Daniels has gone down, we're like, all right, Marcus Mariota is at least a streaming option. And we've seen him for 3 starts so far. He's had QB6, QB19, and QB19 finishes. I mean, that's like the definition of a streamer. We hope that there's upside. We know that he's probably not going to be special. Beyond the impact on himself, though, Marcus Mariota is clearly a negative for the offense versus Jayden Daniels, which is not a surprise. Just about any team is losing value when it goes from its starting quarterback to its backup. But just to look at the impact so far in those 3 starts that we've got, 41 points and 400 total yards in that first Mariota start, which of course came against the Raiders. 27 points for Washington, but just 294 total yards at the Falcons the following week. Then his most recent start, 7 points, 260 yards at Kansas City in week 8. So the totality, I think, is like, it's a meh offense, and Mariota for Jayden Daniels hurts everybody around him.
Yeah, I think this offense needs a healthy Terry McLaurin to, at least get to that next level, even with Mariota. I think it's going to be a struggle without McLaurin, and he's very likely not going to play this week. Sounds like he could also miss week 11. Then they get a week 12 bye. So maybe for week 13, he's back. I will say for Mariota, I mean, for starters, he's averaged 29 rushing yards in those 3 starts, which is a nice number. He still needs the passing production on top of that to be useful. He does get Miami in week 11 and Dallas in week 17. So I think if you're struggling at quarterback and have been, kind of working the wire and streaming at the position, I do think Mariota is worth grabbing, at least for those 2 weeks, if nothing else. Those are 2 top 5 matchups for quarterbacks, so that's good. Otherwise, it's, I think it's Deebo Samuel and Zach Ertz until Terry McLaurin gets back. And Deebo, kind of good news, bad news for Deebo. In the short term, good news, has a 28% target share in his 4 games without Terry McLaurin this season, averaging 7 targets across those 4 games. Now, his fantasy finishes with Mariota this season: wide receiver 69, wide receiver 11, wide receiver 65. So he's, dudded in 2 of those 3 games. And then Zach Ertz also has gotten a target boost in games without McLaurin, but his fantasy finishes with Mariota: tight end 24, tight end 32, and tight end 23. So there just hasn't been enough passing production to go around from Mariota to support either of these guys. I would still lean towards starting Deebo Samuel this week. I just think if a guy's going to project for that type of target share, he's a decent fantasy play. I think the production will be better. Zach Ertz is, on the fringes, I think, of usability, but he looked washed last year. He looks even more washed to me this year. Now that this offense is going to kind of probably be subpar with Mariota, Ertz is someone I would rather not have to use.
I mean, to be fair, peak Zach Ertz wasn't all that impressive a watch versus NFL tight ends.
Agreed.
I'm trying not to play any Commanders this week against Detroit at Miami in week 11. It's probably our best shot to gauge whether there's going to be any fantasy usability after the week 12 bye. And then, we'll see at that point if Washington officially shuts down Jayden Daniels, who else is healthy on that offense. Jacory Krosky-Merritt is another guy I would try not to use this week. Let's hope that the usage is good enough this week, though, that we can consider him potentially usable for that week 11 game at Miami.
Yeah, we'll see. He, obviously struggled again early last week, and then we saw Chris Rodriguez get more carries, in the second half, 4th quarter of that game. So we'll see how that shakes out. For JCM, you were hoping a healthy Daniels made this offense good, gave them, positive game scripts, and that's, much less likely to be the case with Mariota.
Yeah, agreed. I think he's likely irrelevant outside of non-PPR leagues. We'll see if he can give us some value in those leagues going forward. Jared, talking about backfields that are letting us down, the Giants really let us down in week 9, and it seemed like Brian Daboll's fault more than anything, right?
Yeah, I mean, the plan was clearly from the get-go to have this be a split backfield. Devin Singletary and Tyrone Tracy both played 5 snaps each on the Giants' first drive of the game. And Singletary was more effective in this game as a runner. He ended up playing more snaps. He had 7 more snaps than Tyrone Tracy. He had 3 more carries than Tyrone Tracy. Singletary also got all 5 of the Giants' snaps inside the 10-yard line. But you had Tyrone Tracy run more pass routes, out-target Singletary 4-2. So just like an ugly 50-50 split on a subpar offense with a quarterback who's also stealing rushing work. Like, if this is how it's going to be, Tracy and Singletary are both like low-end RB3s. I still have some hope that Tracy kind of reemerges as a lead guy here. I just think he's better. He was better than Singletary last year. He's the younger back. So Tracy's worth hanging on to. But ideally, you're not using either of these guys this week.
I would have more patience for this kind of usage if we didn't already see these two guys compete last year. And what we saw last year was Devin Singletary open the season as the starter and Tyrone Tracy work ahead of him. So did Devin Singletary have some euthanizing with a Y surgery in the offseason, or Tyrone Tracy like lost a ligament at some point that we didn't hear about? I don't understand why you wouldn't start by assuming that Tyrone Tracy is your better option and, make them prove that that's not the case. And that, I know that Devin Singletary had a better game, but they started out splitting the usage, just like you said. So we don't really get a good read on it at that point. I don't know. We'll see exactly how they use both backs going forward. But everything to me about Brian Daboll since he left Buffalo just continues to reinforce that he's really not that good a coach. He's just like okay at best. And he has made a lot of money off of being in Buffalo when Josh Allen figured it out.
Who's worse, Brian Daboll or Joe Brady?
We'll see when Joe Brady gets his head coaching job next year. My guess would be, I don't know. It's difficult for me right now. I can't call a leader between them. I just hope that nobody that I'm friends with is a fan of whatever team hires Joe Brady next year.
I will say with Daboll, I do like what he's doing for Jackson Dart. I think he's changed the offense to fit what Jackson Dart does well. So I'll give him that.
Yeah. So I guess I'll put Daboll a little bit ahead of Joe Brady, who I think has made the offensive structure in Buffalo worse than it was before he took over. So we'll leave that one aside for now. It matters, I think, what happens with this Giants backfield going forward, because we do have some positive matchups. They're not really upcoming though. We've got Chicago this week, which is a good spot. So I'm hoping we get some clearer usage here, because right after that, we've got Green Bay, Detroit, New England, and then the week 14 bye. That's going to be a 3-week stretch of tough defenses for running backs. We probably don't want to use either of these guys for any of those games. I don't know if we can use either one against Chicago. So I guess I'm just hoping for some clarity, or Tyrone Tracy taking over before we get back from that week 14 bye, because then we've got Washington, Minnesota, and the Raiders beyond that. There's potentially usable spots for fantasy running backs if we've got a situation that makes them usable.
Yeah, and again, I still think it's Tracy who's more likely to be a fantasy factor for us down the stretch. If it was, crazy stuff happens all the time in fantasy football in the NFL. But if it was Devin Singletary, I'd be pretty shocked. So, like, Singletary is a fine stash in deep leagues, but Tracy's the one I'd much still rather have rostered at this point.
Yeah. Bears backfield threatens a lack of clarity going forward because we missed DeAndre Swift last time out. We got a huge game from Kyle Monangai. And then since then, Ben Johnson said, I think we have the ability to move the ball a number of different ways on offense. Each week is going to have a different story, but yeah, hopefully they feel a little bit of competition amongst themselves to make it clear to the coaching staff that you need to get the ball in my hands. And that's a good thing. That was answering a question about splitting the backfield work and whether Kyle Monangai is going to get the ball more going forward, even with DeAndre Swift back. He has returned to practice this week. It sure sounds like Ben Johnson is hoping that the backfield merits a split in work, if not somebody commanding more work. And he's been around DeAndre Swift enough that I have a hard time believing he's waiting for DeAndre Swift to earn more work or prove that he deserves more work. So to me, it's a positive for Kyle Monangai, and then, we'll see exactly how things split.
Yeah, I think it at least sounds like the door is open for Monangai to earn more work, which he'd already been doing. Obviously, he had the big game last week. Now, the big game last week came against the Bengals. I believe if Swift was in that position and Monangai was out, Swift would have had just as big a game. If you look at their numbers prior to last week, DeAndre Swift was beating Monangai 4.6 yards per carry to 4.4. Swift had a slight lead in PFF rushing grade. Monangai was beating Swift in both yards after contact per attempt and missed tackles forced per attempt. So it's been kind of a draw so far. And Ben Johnson comes from Detroit, where they had that committee backfield with multiple guys. So I think it's going to be a committee going forward. I think it's possible Monangai takes over as like the slight leader in that committee, at least on early downs. Swift probably continues to play more in passing situations. And this week against the Giants, you could see this team run for 200 yards against the Giants. They've been so bad. The Bears running game has looked so good. Like there could be room for both these guys this week. Beyond that, though, as we had talked about before, the Bears have the toughest running back schedule from week 11 on. Not a single positive matchup yet. A bunch of, top 10 running back defense is still on the schedule. So I'd consider selling either of these guys after this week, because if it's going to be a 50-50 split and the matchups aren't going to be as good, we're probably talking about Swift and Monangai both being RB3s at best.
I agree. I would love to be able to sell either of them. Make sure it's for a good price, but both potential sell candidates. And we'll see about the split this week. I think we got to expect it to be pretty near even for this game, but it wasn't that far from that before Swift went down and they both produced. So both good plays for this week. Keenan Allen, on the other hand, not nearly as good a play for week 10 as he was just a few weeks ago. And Jared, it was, I believe 2 weeks ago, maybe it was 3 weeks ago, that we put Keenan Allen in the sell column of our weekly trade targets article. And honestly, it's gone even worse for him the past 2 games than I thought it was going to as I was writing that one up. What about you?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's crazy. Aronde Gadsden, this day 3 rookie tight end, has just completely changed the Chargers offense. The Chargers offense that has this really strong wide receiver trio. That's just how good Gadsden has been. So, Gadsden leads the Chargers in pass routes over the last 2 weeks. Keenan Allen has been down at 50% and 54% of the routes the last 2 games. That's just not a usable level from a fantasy perspective. Again, part of it's been Gadsden playing more. Part of it's been Trey Harris, their rookie wide receiver, playing a bit more. His routes are up from 25% to 34% over the last 2 weeks. And the Chargers also have just been running fewer 3 wide receiver sets. 58% of their plays were in 3 wide receiver sets over the first 7 weeks of the season, down to 47% over the last 2. So all that stuff is kind of combined to kind of crush Keenan Allen's playing time. Now, again, it's the NFL, matchup-based league. Things change from week to week. There are going to be games the rest of the way where they're back up to 70, 80% 3 wide receiver spots, especially in games where the Chargers find themselves trailing. But just the fact that they can do this with Keenan Allen and make him a halftime player kind of makes him a tough guy to rely on in fantasy lineups on a weekly basis.
And that he was already the 3rd guy among their wide receivers in the playing time split, and that they have pulled that playing time away with the emergence of Aronde Gadsden, I think tells us or reinforces that Keenan Allen's not a difference maker. He's a consistent, reliable veteran who was a good presence to have out there early in the season while they're kind of putting all these new pieces together and trying to make everything work. But now that they've got this emergent rookie who is more of a difference-making talent on the field, it makes sense to say, all right, our 33-year-old guy, we're going to sit him down a little bit more because he's not changing anything in the coverage. So it's worrisome for Keenan Allen going forward. He might pop here and there, but I would love to still be able to sell him if you have opportunities to do so. I don't see a reason for the Chargers to make a drastic switch back. I also wonder if losing Joe Alt, their left tackle, for the season now, makes the whole, obviously it creates another issue for the offense, but I wonder if it puts the whole offense in danger of not supporting all the pieces as much as they have been.
Yeah, for sure. And we've seen it. We've had pretty big sample sizes this year of the Chargers with Joe Alt and without Joe Alt, and Justin Herbert's efficiency has kind of cratered without Joe Alt. 4 games in which Alt either missed or played 10 or fewer snaps, 6.5 yards per pass attempt for Justin Herbert. That's down from 8.3 yards per attempt in the 5 games with Joe Alt. So it's definitely bad news for everyone involved here. For Keenan Allen specifically, and we've seen it too with Herbert's average target depth go way down without Joe Alt. So, that's good for Keenan. He does do the short range stuff, but I also wonder if we're going to continue to see, more 2 tight end sets from the Chargers to just, help out with blocking. So kind of good news, bad news for Keenan. Again, I will say with the remaining schedule for the Chargers, they have games still against Philly, KC, and Dallas. That's weeks 14, 15, 16. Those are games where they could be trailing, they could be high scoring games where that could be good news for Keenan Allen's playing time. So again, he's not a drop to me. He's just someone that I think you got to realize the floor is low going forward because of this playing time issue.
Yeah, I agree with all that, and we'll see where it goes. We're going to close this out with a Bucs offense that has questions to answer before this week and going beyond that. We were hoping to get Bucky Irving back this week. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. He and Chris Godwin still not practicing Wednesday or Thursday, so it looks like they're going to miss week 10. We did, however, get Emeka Egbuka back to full health coming out of the bye. He's been a full practice participant. He should be good to go going forward. And all of that goes into a Patriots matchup that's been pass funneling to this point, right?
Yeah, for sure. So I'd like the spot for Baker and the passing game weapons for sure. The Patriots 5th in our run defense power rankings, 20th against the pass. Pretty similar splits in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs versus quarterbacks and pass catchers. So I like Emeka Egbuka, obviously. I think Tez Johnson and Cade Otton are viable lower end fantasy starters in this game. And as far as the backfield goes, assuming Bucky Irving is out, we saw the split between Rachaad White and Sean Tucker get a lot closer in Tampa Bay's last game. White ended up outsnapping Sean Tucker in that game 57% to 34%, but the carries were just 13 to 12 in favor of Rachaad White. I do, though, like Rachaad White a lot better in this matchup because of the Patriots defense, how good they've been against running backs on the ground. They're allowing a league low 54 running back rushing yards per game, but they've allowed the most running back receptions and the fourth most running back receiving yards. So I don't think either back's going to do much on the ground in this game. I do think Rachaad White should be productive enough in the passing game where you can use him as a RB2 this week.
Thank goodness. I'm just glad to have one more usable week for Rachaad White in one of our shared dynasty leagues, so I don't have to go fishing for some schlub.
At least one more week. I mean, I don't know. Bucky Irving does not seem close to returning to me.
Yeah, I'm being rewarded for not jumping on trying to sell Rachaad White at peak value a couple years ago now.
There you go.
Head to draftsharks.com now to get help setting your lineup and make those trades that I failed to make when Rachaad White was at that peak value before the crash. The team dashboard got some serious upgrades recently from what used to be our team intel page. That's ready to give you specific lineup recommendations for any and every team that you have synced on draftsharks.com. The free agent finder is ready to help you fill any holes that you might have before the week starts. And you can also find articles covering trade targets, recent usage, defenses to stream, and much more. So check the show notes below for links to whatever it is that you need, and let Draft Sharks be your unfair advantage.